Hi, I'm Mo. Are you still looking for a deck for set champs or even DLC Seattle? Let's take a little bit today and talk about choosing the best deck for you and the event you're looking to attend. In a game like Disney Lorcana, we have so many powerful color combinations and archetypes among those color combinations that lead to a very diverse metagame, and picking a deck out of them is intimidating. Here in front of me, I have the top 64 breakdown for Las Vegas. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about decks from Vegas because I was there, but also it's going to be one of the more influential events in moving forward when looking at Seattle, when looking at any remaining set champs. So, starting from the top, we have Ruby Sapphire as the most represented in Top Cut. Definitely not a surprise. It was also the most represented in the tournament in general. Amethyst Ruby, not too far behind. Definitely nothing crazy there. Amber Steel, which was a deck, Steel Song, was a deck that a lot of people expected probably a little bit bigger of a showing out, is a little bit further behind the surprise runner of Emerald Steel. Emerald Steel is in this event, a little bit of the boogeyman. It was a little bit of the scary deck that not everyone had just a lot of practice against in this particular set. Continuing, we've got represent best deck Amethyst Emerald down below that. And then on the other side of things, we have Amber Emerald, both Lemon Lime and the Hyper Aggro version that we'll be talking about here in a little bit. Amber Amethyst, I'm pretty sure those are mostly, if not all, Hyper Aggro. A couple Sapphire Steels, one Blurple, and one Ruby Steel. Both are really cool decks to take a look at, but we'll talk about one of them today. So, let's talk a little bit about different decks in more of like a thought process. So let's talk about your most comfortable deck. What is the deck that's your pet deck? The deck that you make changes to about every 2 or 3 days. You listen to people talk about it, whether in, video format or podcast, and you want this deck to be the best for whatever reasons. Maybe you have the most fun playing it. Maybe you legitimately think it's the best deck. Let's talk about some pros of playing your most comfortable deck, bringing in a comfort pick to an event. The pros are you know the matchups. You know exactly how your deck is going to fare into Ruby Sapphire, into Steel Song, into Ruby Amethyst when walking into an event. You have the muscle memory. This is a underrated skill when it comes to performing with different decks, is you know the plays you should be making. It's less likely to misplay a deck that you've played 1,000 times. You've seen the lines. You know exactly what you're looking for game by game. You have a strong mental game is another pro for this, and that's continuing on, but you generally know when matchups are won and lost. You know how to play towards your outs, and you know what it means when your opponent does something. If I have a Diablo and I'm on the draw, my opponent's on the play, and I see them have to skip their turn to brawl my Diablo, that slows them down. But if they had to do something a little bit more unusual, like ink and play something else, it lets me really have a eye-opener to how I'm going to win this game in the future. You can sense weakness in your opponent's plays. If you're playing your comfortable deck, you're more likely going to have more fun in an event. A lot of us, we can get hyper competitive and winning equals fun, but not always. Sometimes it's just fun to play what you think is fun. And finally, you have trust in this deck. You know what it can do. You've played it time and time again, and you really have the know-how of how to get yourself out of bad situations. The cons of playing your most comfortable deck is it could be a weak choice into the field. I took Emerald Amethyst into a set champs this past week, and I played against, I think, 4 or 5 steel decks. A lot of them are out to counter the Emerald Steel deck, but we take a lot of flack in those. Like, you're starting to see more decks pick up cards like Grab Your Swords, and I took a deck because it was my most comfortable deck, and it turned out to be weak into the field. I went 4 wins, 2 losses, and bubbled out at 10th or 11th place. I don't remember, but it's a real, like, eye-opening experience to see that and see the meta evolve and, like, inside these small little local metas. And then the other con is you could pigeonhole yourself. And what I mean by that is you make yourself into almost a one-trick player. You know, am I an Emerald Amethyst guy, or am I a Lorcana competitor? And sometimes you really just have to take a time and say, I need to make the best choice for this event. Sometimes it is the most comfortable. So when we're talking about comfort picks, I can't not talk about my deck list for Vegas. Preparing for Vegas, I had practice partners at home, and we really only played the big 3 decks coming in, I thought. I practiced against Ruby Amethyst, I practiced against Ruby Sapphire, and we practiced against Steel Song over and over and over again. And when I went to Vegas, that's all I played until I rolled top 16. And then we move forward a little bit, and in set champs, I'm playing against decks like Mufasa for the first time. Reminder, I'm a returning player, and I don't know exactly what's happening. And there's a lot of lines and plays I don't see. But I think this was a great choice for Vegas. Until I hit top 16, I played against one of the big 3 decks, and my deck was ready. I knew exactly what I needed to see to beat Ruby Sapphire, what I needed to see to beat Ruby Amethyst and Steel Song. And it really held up well for me. So, bringing in a comfort pick, you know, kind of saying through practice, my comfort pick also became the best pick for me for this event, in my opinion. So, I'm not going to talk too much about Emerald Amethyst just because, I got a couple videos. If you want to check those out, please do. But let's talk about the best deck. These are the decks you see on Dreamborn. These are the decks you see crushing tournaments left and right. These are the Ruby Sapphire, the Ruby Amethyst, and the Steel Song going into Vegas. These are the decks that I was prepared to see and knew if I took one of these decks in, I would have a contender. So when we look at the pros of the deck is a contender. If you're bringing Ruby Sapphire into the meta, you know what that deck can do. You know the power level of that deck is so incredibly high compared to other decks. You have good matchups. You can't be the best deck and not have matchups that aren't amazing. Your spread looks fantastic. And it just really goes to show, if you're bringing it into running into a wide range of decks, these ones are going to be the ones that win more often than not. You have consistency. The best decks, in my opinion, are all well built. You have these templates. You have these deck skeletons and cores you find online. They're incredibly consistent for a reason. Ruby Amethyst sees almost all of its answers throughout a game because it's just such a consistent deck. Ruby Sapphire, you hit an item into Hiram and your whole deck is online. And the last pro I'll talk is when you're entering a match, you have an expectation of performing well because your deck is a contender. You know it's one of the best. It's been here before. It has won tournaments and it can win more. Let's talk a little bit about the cons of bringing the best deck into these events. You may not know matchups. So I'm talking if you're bringing one of these decks and it's not your comfort deck. Let's say you pick up Ruby Sapphire 2 weeks before the event. You're not going to know it as well as you know Emerald Amethyst or whatever your pet deck in particular is. You really Like, you may have just less familiarity and expertise when it comes to what cards you ink, what cards you don't ink, what you need to hold. I watched a Ruby Sapphire mirror once, and I just noticed there was one player sticking to the strategy, ramping hard, and the other player was just going slow and steady. And by the end of the game, the player ramping hard had no resources against the slow and steady player. He tried to rush them down, and they caught up, and just that removal really overtook. Another con is everyone knows your name. Everyone knows the deck you're playing. No person truly prepared for one of these events doesn't have a game plan for Ruby Sapphire, Ruby Amethyst, Steel Song, and future events we'll talk about a little bit. But you're entering into a tournament with a target on your back, in a way. And that can definitely be a downside. Sometimes, especially if you're just picking this deck up in the weeks before an event, your opponent will know the matchup better than you do from their end, and that can be a detriment to your performance. And a last con is, even though you have these expectations of performing well, expectations can be stressful if they don't show up, you know? You make one misplay in round 5 and you don't get your draw in, and then you can let that mentally steamroll you into losing out of the tournament. It can happen. I've heard stories. Expectations of your deck to perform add a level of stress to you. Let's talk about these best decks, at least entering into Vegas. Not that any of them are any slackers now. Ruby Sapphire. In my opinion, even post-Vegas, this is going to be the most represented deck and probably the best performing deck. It is insane what this deck can do. Let's talk a little bit about it for anyone who's not familiar. Ruby Sapphire has a very consistent turn 1, 2, and 3. Their ideal turn 1 would be to play a 1-drop item, we'll say a popsicle. They get to draw and float card advantage. Turn 2, they play a Tipo or a 1-jump ahead. The Tipo's a little bit better. Get an extra card in their inkwell. In turn 3, they'll be able to ink, have 4, and play their Hiram Flaversham or their Grandma Talib, but the Hiram's the scary one. We're talking about optimal lines. And they draw 2 and put just the threat of drawing even more turn after turn. 1/6 is not the easiest thing to deal with on turn 3. And even if you have the brawl, that's still a turn of tempo lost while they already got 2 cards back for their Hiram and their item that floats. As this deck progresses into the late game, it's going to really look to ramp further through cards like How Far I'll Go, more 1-jump ahead, and Fishbone Quill. In the mid game, it's going to control with solid 5/6 drops from Maui and Madame Medusa, keeping anything you're pressuring with off the board. And then once you hit turn 7 is when the game really starts to turn against this deck. If you're the aggro deck and they've hit that 7 ink turn, they can play these huge threats like Be Prepared, Scar, and just keep you limited on your resources because these mass board wipes just take you out of the game. You can see a lot of these decks will play the Shift Sisu line. This one does not. But whenever Sisu can get played, it's a body that's also a Be Prepared against some decks, especially with ice blocks. It puts in so much work that by the end of the game, whenever they're putting out their Tamatoa and they're questing for 5 in a turn and hitting you with dime, it's just like you knew it was over 3 turns before. This deck is incredibly powerful and almost always a good choice to bring into an event. Let's talk a little bit about some cons of playing Ruby Sapphire. Beyond just what we already talked about, that everyone has a game plan for you. But I would say a solid con of this deck is, after playing it and seeing very good players play it, I'm not a huge fan of the mirror match. I feel like it can be heavily one-sided if your opponent also knows how to play their cards. If they're not just turbo ramping and rushing in a game you don't need to be rushing in, I can definitely see the better player losing sometimes just because of the draw. your opponent had the Brawl for your Hiram, or you didn't have it at all and you just get blown out. I'm not a huge fan of this mirror. I do think it's workable. I think good players can make it work, but once good players start playing against good players, it gets a little sticky. Another downside is kind of a little bit of a rise of hyper aggro. Puts a lot of pressure on this deck. I would say Emerald Steel puts an interesting amount of pressure on this deck too. This deck can play against Emerald Steel well, but it also can have some struggles if you don't see the Brawl for the Diablo, and even if you do, you losing that turn away from your ramp can just stunt you. But yeah, if I was going to Seattle, I would have to be considering this as a major deck to pick, or any set champs. It's fantastic and the best deck for a good reason. Next deck we're going to talk about, Ruby Amethyst, everybody's favorite. So Ruby Amethyst has been the longest living deck in Lorcana history. I played in set 1, and this was an incredibly powerful control archetype. And of course, once the Madame Mim and Merlin cards came out in set 2, the deck really changed. So what this deck attempts to do is out-resource the opponents and deliver unavoidable finishers in the late game. Let's talk a little bit about this deck's 1, 2, and 3. Turn 1, this deck isn't really looking to do a whole lot. You play one of your 1-cost characters that allow you to draw. Turn 2, you have a decision point between drawing with that character or keeping them on the board to pressure, or bouncing them for your Madame Mim Snake. But the scariest turn 2 that this deck has is Flynn Rider Frenemy. If you're playing a deck like Ruby Sapphire, you have to be aware of what this card can do to you. You see it hit the board on turn 2, and then their turn 3, they follow up with a Sisu, a Fox bouncing the 1-drop, and just once they start racking up those 3 lore a turn, it gets really hard to turn this game around. Obviously you have answers, but as this deck goes into the mid game, they start looking to draw just tons of cards with their Merlin Rabbit and their friends on the other side so they can find their outs. Moving into the late game, they have a nice removal package with Elsa the Fifth Spirit and Maui. The 2 ladies in red dresses, fantastic. And then as you translate into the late game, so Ruby Amethyst is going to chip you for lore. It's going to hit you sometimes with the Flynn. It's going to make you answer their guys early. And then to finish you off, they often look to play a Queen's Castle. This hits you for 2 every turn. And once they hit that 7 ink mark where they can start playing these Be Prepared, playing these huge threats that are guaranteed to trade for 1 or more cards, it's really hard to deal with a 7 health Queen's Castle. Sometimes they'll get 2, or in this deck's case, even 3 of them on the field on you, and you just run out of options to win. It's still not the easiest answer for a location like that, unless you're playing something like blue. This deck is fantastic and very strong, but it's not without its weaknesses. I would say it has an interesting matchup into the field. I'm not a huge fan of its Songs matchup. I'm not a huge fan of its Emerald Steel matchup. Emerald Amethyst, I'll go ahead and throw the shout out there. I love playing against Ruby Amethyst, but except for that fella that beat me. GG's. But definitely, it doesn't have the power ceiling that a deck like Ruby Sapphire has. It scales very well into the late game, but if your opponent's able to nickel and dime you, if they're able to throw off your tempo strategy, you're sometimes just stuck with not too many cards in your hand and just not the best comeback situation. But this is also a deck that highly rewards skilled players. If you've played it before, if you've spent months and months on this deck, I would definitely put it on a higher tier sometimes. Alright, let's talk about the other big bad when when looking at DLC Vegas. Steel Songs, another deck that's been around really since set 1 to some extent, and it's had a lot of iterations. The deck list I pulled here, actually a very friendly fella I met in Vegas. It was my round 9 opponent, and we intentionally drew against each other, but kept up a little bit. But I really love this list for songs because it's very low to the ground, and I think that's important moving forward, so I wanted to kind of highlight it. Songs 1, 2, and 3. Turn 1, they're going to look to play a Cinderella or a Daisy Duck, sometimes a Robin Hood. They're all fine options depending on what else is in your hand. Songs feels almost like a combo-based deck because you're looking for cards that make other cards better. So if they play, let's talk about ideal. They'll play Cinderella. They'll have a Let the Storm Rage On in their hand. This essentially locks you out of playing a character turn 1 if they are on the play. Because if you play a character, they get to just kill it for free with Let the Storm Rage On, get a free card, and you're already starting the game on the back foot. Daisy Duck puts so much pressure on and can just solo some matchups. It gives them a little bit of life into Ruby Sapphire, which is normally a very bad matchup for this deck. But I would say the aggro package of Piglet, Mr. Smee, and Daisy Duck puts in a lot of work in that matchup. And then Robin Hood being their other 1-drop sets up for a shift 3 for the bigger Robin Hood coming up. But really, in the early game, they're looking to play some characters that answer your characters or that require answers. They're looking to start to find songs with Ariel Spectacular Singer, sing them with Prince Naveen or your Robin Hood shift, or even your Cinderella shift eventually, that this deck has. And one of the key aspects for this deck is it has access to Pete, the games referee. Pete is one of the most powerful cards. Actually, I'll just say it. He's the most powerful card to come out of Shimmering Skies. Changes the meta in such a scary way that it makes a deck like Songs that has so much firepower, so much high end. It puts a lot of threat onto their existence because you play a Pete and stall out their turns, and there's not a lot that they can do sometimes. Moving into the late game, you have threats like the Robin Hood and the Cinderella Stout-Hearted. You establish the Cindy Stout-Hearted and the Rapunzel against any deck that's not Ruby Sapphire, and that's massive. It just can answer everything they hope to play. When you talk about songs, you have to talk about their songs. So this deck list has 1 copy of Bare Necessities. Really interesting here because it's an aggro-oriented deck, so singing this at an opportune time and pulling those Be Prepareds or potentially Grab Your Swords out of your opponent's hand is huge. 4 Storm and 4 Strength of a Raging Fire, definitely just your steel removal options. Along came Zeus, big steel removal option. And 4 Whole New World. Notably no Grab Your Swords in this build, but I feel like that was probably the right call for Vegas. Just depending, but definitely a very strong deck. Let's talk a little bit about their weaknesses. I already mentioned Pete, but Ursula Deceiver, the 2-drop Ursula, can hunt their songs out of their hand and just keep them out of the game sometimes. Very powerful options. And you're seeing a lot of decks on green, not just Emerald Amethyst, but Emerald Steel, we'll be talking about coming up. Just being able to totally just rob this deck of its entire hand sometimes. So, let's talk about a pit hole that I've found many players falling into for finding the best deck. This is a deck that is built to counter the meta. This is the deck that you're saying, I'm going to play against this, this, and this, and this should beat all of them, or have a really good matchup into one of them. If you're playing the best deck, it can definitely be powerful because look at the pros. You are under the radar. No one's going to know what you're bringing in. I'm not going to get rid of anyone's spice, but I played against a deck in set champs this past weekend in top 8 that I believe was very well suited to beat the deck I was playing at the time, and just having a really good read into it. And just me not knowing their turn 1, their turn 2, their turn 3, I think is very powerful. If you're building a deck to counter the meta, you know outright you have a few very good matchups. You're playing a deck that's like, we'll talk about this deck a little bit later, but we're talking like maybe Ruby Steel Locations. I think Ruby Steel Locations does pretty fantastic into Emerald Steel. I did a little play testing this weekend and noticed that too. But you have these good matchups that you are by design. You know your limits, so you know what your deck can do. I brought Emerald Amethyst to Vegas, and I was playing Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo and Ursula Deceiver of All. My opponent had the opportunity to brawl my Ursula Deceiver, and instead he brawled something else. I'm trying to remember what it was, but we'll put it on the same tier as a Merfolk because I wasn't threatening a lot of lore with just the Ursula Deceiver. And then I play Goat and sing Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo on the Goat and ping for 5 in a single turn and just take the game over. My opponent didn't know that was an option. And maybe they did, but they didn't realize it at the time. Super powerful. You know what your deck can do. There are very little surprises for yourself and a lot for your opponent. And you have expectations to absolutely eat a matchup. I brought a very aggressive package to beat Ruby Sapphire in Vegas, and it turned out very well for me throughout most of the event. Definitely some expectations going in. When I saw Ruby Sapphire, I knew my particular deck was favored. Let's talk about the cons of bringing in the best deck. Is you could have misread the field. You could be bringing blue-yellow princesses because you think it has a huge matchup against Ruby Sapphire. I don't know how blue-yellow princesses play, forgive me. And then you don't play against any Ruby Sapphire and you're set champs. I'm sure if you're going to Seattle, you're probably going to play against Ruby Sapphire, but if you misread the field with a deck like this, it can backfire horrendously. You could just end up rolling into, say, we feel like Songs is on the downturn. It's kind of, but feel like Songs is on the downturn, and then it ends up being the meta call for this event. And if your deck has a weakness to Songs, but it beats Ruby Amethyst, Emerald Steel, and Ruby Sapphire, you could just get eaten alive by those matchups by the players that had that breed. Less familiarity / expertise. So this, just depends on your time, but a lot of times when you're building a deck like this, you'll throw it together and be making changes on it. Throw it together a week or two before the event, be making some changes on it up to the day of, and it doesn't have that familiarity as you had playing the same deck week after week. Say you're a Ruby Sapphire fanatic, but you really want to bring Emerald Steel to your set champs. You're not going to have the same experience on Emerald Steel as you do Ruby Sapphire. And that can come to shoot yourself in the foot sometimes, just depending on the amount of time you have to practice. And expectations can let you down. I lost to a Ruby Sapphire player in round 7, a fantastic player, great human all around. They kept up with me all weekend, but I lost to that matchup, and I just was eating that matchup all weekend, and that one loss kind of opened my eyes a little bit. Because that deck is so incredibly powerful that even if your deck is engineered to beat it, sometimes you just don't. You just can't. It's insane. Yeah, I don't actually have an example for the best deck because I don't want to take any guesses on anyone's deck list or just throw out an example. But let's talk about how all of these other things, the best, the most comfortable, and the best, become the best deck. The best deck for the event has every pro we've mentioned so far. It's a comfortable deck. It's a great deck into the field. It plays like you know it like the back of your hand. It is a deck that you know your matchups very well, and you feel very confident if you were to find your way into a mirror match. The cons of playing the best deck, or the cons of the best deck, not playing it, is good luck finding it. Having the knowledge to make a call like this is something that few players can do, and whenever you find success with this, really relish in it. It's fantastic to see a deck like this come and sweep. In case you haven't guessed it, the best deck for DLC Vegas was Zan Syed's Emerald Steel. There were quite a few camps entering Vegas with Emerald Steel lists, and most of them are pretty similar. You see some on more Tinkerbells, you see some on more Annas, but really the deck core stays pretty similar. This deck is looking to reach a turning point in the game where they're able to just discard all of your resources while building their own and just push you out of the game in 1 or 2 turns in the mid game. This deck has the strongest 1, 2, and 3 curve in the entire game, in my opinion. And let's talk about it. What is this deck going to do on its 1, 2, and 3? Turn 1, pretty simple. They're going to play a Diablo. We're talking about ideal turns, by the way. Turn 1, they're going to play a Diablo. They're going to scout your hand. This is incredibly underrated, because they're going to know what answers you have for what plays they're going to make in the future. Turn 2, they're going to put out an Ursula Deceiver to take a song for the matchups where it matters. Keep in mind, they've already seen your hand at this point. They know if she's going to hit or not. Or, the scarier option, in my opinion, is Morph Space Goo. So, whenever you have both Morph and Diablo on the field, it presents an interesting conundrum to your opponent. But let's continue talking about turn 2 first. They're going to discard an action to shift their Diablo. And from that point, they have the option to sing a song. They can sing Strength or Storm to remove your character from the field, or they can just quest and hold their resources. They've already seen your hand at this point. They know which one's the better play of the two. And if there's both a Morph and a Diablo on the field at turn 2, you don't have the splash to deal with both. You're going to have to make a choice. Even if you have the answer to one, if you don't have the answer to both, the game could get out of control very quickly, because turn 3, you're going to see that Shift Beast come out. Sometimes you may even see an Ursula Deceiver of All come out, depending on what sort of hand they're looking at. The Beast Tragic Hero, if it goes unanswered, it's drawing them 2 cards every turn, and then the second you put a damage on it, it's a huge removal threat to anything on your board. If they play the Ursula Deceiver, it just adds to the threats that you need to deal with without potential splash damage, because that Morph's a ticking time bomb, waiting to become a beast, waiting to become a Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. And I've seen some builds, even play around with Cinderella Stout-Hearted. It's kind of insane what all Morph allows for this deck. But you just have so much target selection. When this deck draws its ideal opening, it's so hard to come back from before they've even started discarding you. So they establish that in the mid game, they're going to look to get some Prince Johns down, maybe an Ursula Deceiver, and start double singing their discard songs, double singing Sudden Chill. A card like Hypnotize is so fantastic even to play without Prince John, because it's a +1, and getting your opponent low on cards, it's insane. This game, the one sorta downside to this deck is if you can find a way to keep up with their card discard, the late game is not as crazy as some other decks, but you have Pete Games Referee to control when your opponent can answer you. And even sometimes, say you played the Diablo, you see the Brawl in their hand, but they're on the draw, and you just play Pete on 3, and you keep your Diablo around, it's just like, are they going to ink that Brawl? Are they going to keep that Brawl? There's just so many potentially just absolutely disgusting turns this deck has. Single target removal to a certain extent, as we don't talk about Bruno. If they have Prince John, it will allow them to draw. The Muses is there to help deal with aggro alongside Tinkerbell Giant Fairy. And talking about Tinkerbell Giant Fairy just for a second, it gives you so much pressure and removal without having to play an action. And I think going forward, that card is going to get so much more value in these kind of decks and others. But this deck's insane. It was a very strong deck to play. This is the exact 60 I lost to. I did not play Zan. But I lost to a very powerful opponent on, I believe, the same 60. And it just has the answers to all of your potential answers. You have Fire the Cannons. What if they have turn 2 Hidden Cove? Sometimes I see people firing the cannons on my base Diablo, even if I don't even know if I have the shift or not, but they're just getting it out of there because they can't deal with it. You have some very strong options into the mid game with Ana. Ana, either play and make your opponent discard a card, very rarely a bad effect, or you can banish chosen damage character. There is also a pseudo Merlin Crab effect to give 2 strength to a character. Comes up from time to time, but let's talk a little bit about potential cons of this deck, because moving forward, this is going to go from the best deck to the best deck. You're going to see this deck be picked up. I wouldn't be surprised to see it be the second most played deck in Seattle and at set championships in general. And that segues to, I am not a personal fan of the mirror match in this deck. So don't get me wrong, it's a very skill-intensive mirror. It absolutely is. And knowing when to hold your resources, when to play which cards, is absolutely fantastic, and it's a blast. But there are some times where, even though this deck has answers to everything, you don't see those. This is a combo-oriented deck, in my opinion. And sometimes, if you don't see your Shift Diablo and they see theirs, and you don't have the answer until you have to hardcast Storm on 3, and that's going to give them an extra draw anyways, and you just lose so much tempo, they're able to start picking apart your hand and translating their game plan into the late game a lot more effectively than you are. I'm not a huge fan of taking into the mirror, at least with the core 60 we're seeing here, which is probably the best way to build this deck at the moment. Some other potential cons is like I said before, it's a combo-oriented deck. You want to see Diablo and in action. You want to see Morph and a potential shift target among Diablo, Beast, and Tink. You want to have your Prince John with your discard actions, and sometimes you get awkward hands. It happens. I think I remember Zach Bivens, one of the best players, talked about his top 64 match, and you can watch it and he just bricks, because like it can happen sometimes with this deck. You can get hands that are all Prince Johns and no removal. Are they statistically unlikely? Yes. But are they possibly going to happen to you over the course of a large event? Yes. You have to keep in mind of that. And just really treat your options the absolute, like, with as much value as you can put into them. And I don't know if I'm fully convinced in the red-blue matchup. So if you're considering red-blue to be the best deck going in, and they've had some time to practice against Emerald Steel, I know it is winnable, but they also just have so many top decks that, like, if I was looking for a deck to beat Emerald Steel, I would definitely consider Ruby Sapphire, because you could top deck a Hiram into your item and just go off from there. Or you just see the Be Prepared off the top of the deck, because this deck cannot interact with their Inkwell. And if they just turbo ink and say, I have 0 cards in my hand, you know, you can bounce some stuff with Muses and try to make me discard, but I'm going to slow you down while I'm slow. I have some amazing things off the top of the deck, and I feel like there could be some really unfortunate games played against Ruby Sapphire. but still feel like this deck is probably favored. Amazing deck, amazing champion. If you've never taken the time to talk with Zan and you see him at an event, very friendly fella. I had a brief conversation in the Top Cut room. Definitely wonderful deck to bring in. So let's talk a little bit about other decks in the game. Here is one of my favorite decks. This is Jonathan Lemme, Gamechops on socials, Blue Steel Sapphire. This deck is fascinating. So when you talk about comfort picks, this is one of the best examples of a comfort pick deck list I have ever seen. Look at all of these one-ofs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 one-ofs, and a lot of them, like, I would imagine you have to play the crap out of this deck to know why and what matchups you want to see it and what's the math behind this. A truly fascinating list. Let's talk a little bit about what they want to do. All Sapphire decks really want to establish a turn 1 item, in this case either Popsicle or Fortisphere, a turn 2 ramp card, which is only 1 Tipo, so it looks like this deck more so skips the turn 2 there. Crazy deck. Turn 3 Fishbone Quill with this one, because you have the means to reload your hand with a whole new world, so Fishbone Quill you can be very aggressive with. And then look into playing your Hiram, your draw cards. I would say Hiram is honestly maybe a secondary draw engine in this deck to a whole new world. Translates into a very strong late game with steel removal. Very effective against low to the ground decks. Grab Your Swords is an insane card. Big Tink is an insane card. You play them both in the same turn because you have a million ink. Oh my god, I just lost my entire board. You've got some Let It Goes to surgically remove larger threats. When you start moving into the mid game, you see this deck trying to get a couple Cogsworth out, maybe alongside a Qianpo. Qianpo plus Cogsworth is one of the most annoying things to deal with if you're on the other side and not playing red. And then the late game win condition is Aerial Treasure Collector and Tamatoa. Both of those are going to be questing for massive amounts every turn. Aerial if you have more items in play than your opponent, which you generally will because these decks are pretty heavy on items, and the items that draw you cards are fantastic. She's going to be questing for 5 every turn. Tamatoa is going to be able to quest for quite a bit, and you combine these with Lucky Dime, and suddenly this deck knocks you out of the game in 2 turns, while they were at 0 before. It's insane. I love the Merlin's Cottage, another one of those, like, you know, you had to put some reps on this deck to, like, warrant a card like this, but if you know your matchups, it just seems like such a really cool deck. I'm not going to talk too much about these decks through here because I don't have the personal experience on them, but I'm sure you can find these creators out there. Here is Kevin's deck from Top 8 of Vegas. This is Lemon Lime Discard, and another one of y'all's probably favorite decks out there. Very strong Diablo deck. Plays a lot like Emerald Steel, but maybe, you know, not quite up there. But still very powerful. You have 2 ways. I think it could honestly compete with Emerald Steel because you have the Ursula Deceivers, but you also have the Bare Necessities to keep actions out of their hand. Getting your Diablo and Cove is just a strong win condition alongside turn 3 Prince John, turn 4 You Have Forgotten Me, which is one of the strongest advantage turns in the entire game. Definitely an insane deck. Under the Sea, there's no baby Kita in this list, so there's no shift and sing, but a lot of times you'll be throwing out Prince Johns, these characters with ward or evasive that just stick to the field, that makes those Under the Seas live before you even know it. Super strong deck. I've seen this a lot at set champs and locally. I think it could be a powerful option looking to go forward. Their turns 1, 2, and 3 are going to be stick a Diablo down, play an Ursula to get a song out of your hand, and play either an Aerial to hunt down songs for perhaps your Prince Naveen in hand or your Muses, or get a Prince John on the field to prepare for that You Have Forgotten Me giant turn 4. Great deck, has a lot of answers to everything. I think from what I've heard from people who are very good at this deck, is a lot of times you might just run into a situation where you lose to yourself. You lose to your own hands. It happens, but super strong. Here's Hyper Aggro. Yeah, for the most part. This deck is pretty insane at its ceiling. It's just looking to end the game as fast as possible. And if you're on the playing this deck, it's suddenly your win rate just skyrockets through the roof. And obviously it saw some success for even being on the draw. Everyone's been there. You've played against Hyper Aggro and you're just trying desperately to get enough ink to play your removal cards and you just don't have it. This particular deck list, I'd like to talk a little bit about Befuddle for bouncing your lower cost characters. It's really awesome. Help make some big removal options a little bit less effective, or even just keeping your things from being attacked into. And the Madame Elephant, I think, is really interesting. You're expanding the bounce package, so there's no snake, so it's actually elephant instead of snake. But the elephant's 3/7. That's pretty hard for a lot of decks to just get off the board. So she's going to see some serious questing, and she gives you removal without having to actually attack something. So you can continue your, going face strategy and be able to get some threats off the board with her, which is really awesome. Moving on. Here's a different variation of Hyper Aggro. Lemon Lime Hyper Aggro by Clara Sear. This deck is awesome. So the biggest, I think, boon to this strategy is you have access to the Clarabelle Shift line and just the ability to refill your hand after your opponent takes a huge advantage. Like, not every deck has just a million Be Prepareds, especially now with a lot of people moving away from songs. And this deck has 0 actions. Like, it looks like a Mufasa deck without Mufasa. It's wild. Very powerful deck. Can just end the game before you even know it. You have options like the Ursula Deceiver to keep those Be Prepareds, grab your swords out of your opponent's hand. You have Cloud Kicker to be a very powerful tempo presence. Just super awesome deck. If you haven't taken the time to look at this list, you really should. This was cooking, and it's great. It had one of the best stream moments with the flip Be Prepared. It was awesome. This is probably my favorite deck that I didn't play at the event. So this is Ruby Steel Locations. Did not get to meet this competitor, did not get to play them, probably luckily for me, but this deck looks so much fun. Turn 1, you have Happy, who has 2 great qualities. During your turn, he gains Evasive, which means it's a 2/1 that's a 1 cost that kills Diablo. And it also is a knight. That is relevant because you have your 7 Dwarves Mine, and whenever you move a knight to the 7 Dwarves Mine, you get to just deal 2 damage to something. That's insane. Being able to move back and forth between RLS Legacy and the Dwarves Mine is just a way to spread some huge damage on the board. I'm not going to talk about this deck's turn 1, 2, and 3 because I don't know it too well. I'm not too well versed in it. But just looking at your options here, you have the Flynn Sisu combination to start racking up early lore. You have Mr. Smee. You have the Robin Hood shift line throughout later on in the game. John Silver, if you've never read this card, for each location you have in play, this character gains resist +1 and +1 lore. That is pretty insane once you start racking up from your 8 locations. Jim Hawkins is here to play them each for free. The Prince Eric is really cool because whenever he is banished, you may banish chosen character. A friend of mine, shout out Hayden, actually showed me that, you can damage your own Prince Eric with your Dwarves Mine, right? Yes. And shoot your own Prince Eric, take him out, and then just banish something for free. So it's just like a 2-cost Dragonfire. It's fantastic. Gustav the Giant's here to play alongside Flynn Rider and just be kind of crazy if you get the ability to challenge and take something out. Super Goof's here to rush some lore, and Tiana is kind of insane. You have both Pete and Tiana in this deck to give you some pressure against actions, but if you have zero cards in your hand, it's so hard to deal with Tiana. I played against a songs list that was playing her, and she just made things really difficult because that resist +2 on a 1/4 body that you can't brawl, you can't just remove with something. Baby Sisu is insane. Some decks have the ability to give your opponents cards, but still. And yeah, but this deck list, pretty fantastic and awesome. And I think that's the last what I have for you guys today. There's so many just crazy combinations that are unexplored. There's some decks we didn't talk about today. We didn't talk about Blurple. We didn't talk about Purple Steel. We didn't talk about Mufasa. There are some just like crazy strategies that can just perform very well moving forward. And I think what you should learn from this today is the best deck, whatever you're entering an event with, just have confidence behind it. Say, hey, I'm bringing this for a reason. I'm bringing this because it's my most comfortable deck. I'm bringing this because it's the deck that I have. I don't have access to a million cards. Expenses are important to consider, honestly. But just feel confident in yourself, know your matchups, and know why you're bringing the deck, I think is the biggest thing to leave here. If I could just get a couple more Daisy Ducks, I bet I could win a set champs. Oh God. Sorry, I didn't know you were still here. I promise I wasn't building hyper aggro or anything. No. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to let me know down below. Subscribe to see some more. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.